Thank you all for tuning in, and please note that today's session will be recorded. So today is our 9th innovation talk ever, and it's fair to say that today's session will be quite unlike any of our other sessions in both form and content. Previous talks have mainly focused on how various tools, technologies, or policies can drive innovation in an organization and its work. But today we are turning our attention to something a little bit different: storytelling. But what is storytelling? How is it important for innovation, and how do major advances in technology and data capture affect our ability to tell stories about who we are and what we do? Today we have 2 experts in the field who will be discussing these questions and many more. They are Hélène Papper, the Director of IFAD's Global Communications and Advocacy Division, which is responsible for our internal and external communication strategies and operations, and Katie Taylor, Founder and CEO of Untold Content, an innovation storytelling firm that supports companies and governmental agencies in scientific, medical, technical, and social innovation fields to effectively communicate their ideas, insights, and impacts. We have posted their full biographies in the chat so that you can get a fuller and better picture of who the speakers are today. So today's 1-hour talk will be structured as follows. Hélène and Katie will spend the next 35 minutes or so discussing the topic in a semi-structured fireside chat format. And then we will open the floor to you, our guests and viewers, to put your questions to both of them. So please write your short question in the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of the screen. And if you see any questions already in there that you like, please click on them to upvote them so that we can answer the most upvoted for questions. Once that is done, we will hand the floor back over to Hélène and Katie, who will offer some final thoughts, and that will be that. In any case, we believe that this is a format that will allow us to go into depth on the subject at hand, and we very much hope that you will enjoy today's talk. So that's enough introduction from me. Over to you, Hélène and Katie.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here, and Katie, it's great to be sharing this virtual stage with you today.
Yes, I feel the same way. Thanks so much, Hélène. And we want to start by defining how Hélène and I are thinking of storytelling. We want to start with debunking, actually, some myths around storytelling. Hélène, share with us your thoughts on this, because it's really enlightening.
Thanks. We're going to, together, we've spoken a lot about this before coming to you. And I want to get you to step out of the box and let's go back to the basics of what we're talking about when we hear about the word storytelling. Debunking the myth, I think, is the right word, because for many, storytelling brings up the image of fiction, good night stories, wonderful moments that you've shared talking to each other, or stories that you've reported to each other. But actually, it's a lot more than that. Storytelling goes back to passing along traditions, culture, identity. The oral tradition, which is still alive in many cultures, is based on the power of telling stories. It's based on the transfer of knowledge. So actually, storytelling is much more related to the transfer of knowledge and facts than what we commonly think it is. It's really about sharing information. Information is education. And the more educated and informed we are with credible facts, the more we have a capacity to then lead to decisions and actions that are based on the original sense of belonging, credibility. But let's even go broader for a second. What's the first thing we do when we're born? We cry. That cry is our first story. It's a story of pain as we take our first breath. It's hunger, it's survival, it's the expression of our humanity. And as we grow, we learn how to use our voice to express our needs, our basic needs to survive: hunger, thirst, affection, well-being, sickness, our voice, our cries, our laughter. When we learn how to speak then and use words, it is to be heard, but also to be understood. It's the expression of our identity. And when that identity is somehow negated, is misunderstood, is not correctly interpreted, or does not elicit a reaction, when we do not feel heard or understood, basically, when it comes to especially meeting our basic needs, necessities that link back to our survival, it leads to frustration. And that frustration can lead to tensions, and those tensions are actually often the ones that spark wars. That's what I witnessed living in conflict zones for close to 15 years, working with communities who are struggling to be heard. I've seen through training hundreds of child soldiers who are struggling to come out of war and into peace, that working with them, giving them the opportunity to understand that they can use their voice instead of their weapons is extremely impactful. Working with warring parties and leaders to exchange their weapons for a microphone when they know they are going to be heard, getting them to use their voice to express their views, opinions, and needs is an incredible way to get them to lower those weapons. But it's not just speaking, of course. Again, it's knowing that they are being heard and understood. The bottom line here is that expressing oneself, speaking, is an action which calls for a reaction. But when that reaction is not the one we expect, that's an issue. But we are conveying information. And the more we learn how to convey that information, tell that story so that we feel we are properly understood and get the reaction we want, then we have the capacity to change the world. And this links very much to what you communicate and how it is included and valued. That's where we get to the how, sorry. We started out with the why. The fact that we've established that everything we do is about how we tell a story, how we inform, how we speak, and who are the people listening. Now, how do you do it effectively? We go from the why of the storytelling to the how. How we tell the story is equally as important as why we tell it. Our life, every single day, in everything we do, is centered around how and what we communicate, and how is that going to lead to a desired outcome. That's also where misinformation and disinformation comes into play. Because if we tell a story that is inaccurate, it will lead to an inaccurate response. And the masters of disinformation know this very well, meaning those who purposefully tell a story that is false, manipulate facts, such as those famous for propaganda, is extremely dangerous. And that's also why you're going to hear more and more as we speak about storytelling across the world and the importance of repositioning storytelling at the core of our practices to create a more sustainable and peaceful world, and a capacity to understand innovation. We are going to hear more about the dignified storytelling. Dignified storytelling specifically avoids behavior information sharing that could cause risk, harm, or mistreatment to any individual or group. So to do that effectively, we have to understand that in the world we live in today, we are no longer just speaking to those who speak the same language, experience the same context, that when our capacity to tell the story for change becomes fundamental, it is fundamental that we are relying on the true facts, that we have the capacity to gather that data, that we use informed consent and informed voices from those that we represent to accurately be able to then portray their story and make sure that it does no harm. Technology today enables us to do that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But really, I've been trying to set the stage in terms of the impact and the core strategic positioning that storytelling, education, information has in our lives without us even realizing it. And it's not just me telling you about it, there's actual science around it. And Katie knows a lot about that, and she's here to tell us what is the science behind it.
Thank you so much, Helen. I think that was incredibly important and powerful for us to start with the why and to recall that ethical, dignified storytelling practices should drive all that we do as leaders, whether we're world making or generating new innovations and new technologies. And so when we're working through some of these definitions to kind of open us up, Helen and I today are defining storytelling quite broadly as the art of using narrative, evidence, and emotions to communicate a message. Typically, there is a desire to achieve a certain outcome, and all of that work should be done through the practice of dignified storytelling. The science behind storytelling is fascinating, and it speaks to why disinformation and misinformation work so powerfully. We are wired for stories. plenty of peer-reviewed research has shown that humans will actually respond with higher levels of memory, understandability, and have better able to take action and feel connected to a message or a piece of information when it's communicated as a story rather than just a data point or a fact on its own. And so with that comes an incredible power to open the human mind, to transform how we perceive one another, how we perceive whole communities. And from an innovation standpoint, I'm sharing the screen just to show some of the many illustrative ways that organizations and corporations are leveraging storytelling to bring innovations to life and to connect with the people who will ultimately be the benefactors or the users of that technology, or who the world is meant to make better. Those innovations are meant to make the world better for people, right? That's why we all wake up in the morning and want to think of innovative ideas and ways to make the world better. And so when we start from a practice, as Helen mentioned, of dignified storytelling, we are in a position of wanting to connect with communities and users and listen strategically to their messages. There's a visual, it's a little technical looking, but if you'll bear with me, the idea behind this, our team at Untold Content created this visual to try to depict that relationship between how does an innovation leader or a global stage leader listen and hear and respond to the stories of individual community members. When innovation is happening in a more dignified practice, those story sharing circles are unbroken. People who are living their everyday lives, who technologies or innovations need to support or make their lives better, they are sharing stories, and those stories have technologies, processes, and people to help elevate their stories upward into larger organizational narratives. And those at the top, those leaders who are making decisions and sharing narratives, what are more formalized stories, they listen and they incorporate those individual human stories into their practices, and they allow those narratives to be then shaped by individual stories. And we believe that through this kind of cyclical view of story sharing and story listening, that we're going to get to a more ethical approach to how we do world making, and also specifically how we innovate and build the futures that we want to build. Helen, I would love to hear, I know we've chatted before this about the different measures and efforts going on within the UN to support this kind of story sharing. Would you mind sharing some about the UN 75?
Yeah. Well, as you know, at the UN, as most of you know, the UN celebrated a year ago its 75th anniversary, or almost 2 years ago now. What time goes by. And I think there was a real broad conversation as to reflecting on 75 years, the capacity that the United Nations had opened the door to bringing populations, cultures, dynamics from across the world around the same table through leadership, right? That was the principle around diplomacy, the necessity to bridge these gaps, these misunderstandings, but also to focus on creating dialogue to make sure that there could be solutions and common solutions that were found to surpass some of the problems that the world was facing that could risk leading to new wars. And so the basic of it was to bring leaders together to create that dialogue. And that had a lot of effectiveness. However, 75 years on, there was also a very harsh reality that we have not moved as far as we wanted along the path of peace and security, of sustainability. And what was missing for that to happen? When the Secretary General made a very strong statement of saying we are, despite the fact that we have the United Nations and this capacity to lead dialogues across the world, we have more wars than ever before, more conflicts than ever before. Why is that? Let us go back to the source of the issue. And the source of the issue is many times decisions and discussions that are held that do not relate to local realities, that have one missing link, which is what are the people actually saying from the ground, the ones who have the basic needs and necessities? How do we get to go back to the sources? And so there was this discussion about going back to local dialogue and how those local dialogues and the capacities then bring it back up to decision-making level would help shape the future of the United Nations, of multilateralism, of decision-making. And, you know, across the world, there were many different ways of trying to do that, you know, and capture these local dialogues, these local conversations, and turn them into data, turn them into something that could be used, that is not just hearsay. What we realized through this process for UN 75, I was based in Colombia, and we did this incredible dialogue sessions across Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela through a methodology called SOLE, which was a single operational learning experiment, which is where we create these methodologies so that people are talking about a common problematic that they have, and that is therefore collated, and the technology enables you to transform that into real life data. And then we did this in an innovative way at IFAD last year, where for the Food Systems Summit, we were able to partner with an organization called Farm Radio International, where we built radio programs to be able to access our smallholder farmers and to engage them. We had hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers engage in these programs and talk about what they were living on the ground, how climate was affecting them, what they needed to make sure that they were going to be able to sustain themselves in these rural areas that had suffered shock after shock from climate to COVID, from coming out of conflicts in many areas. And what we learned out of that was that a lot of the misconceptions or decisions that are being made on thinking that, for instance, all the youth want to leave rural areas, or that women are not active in rural areas, a lot of that was debunked through this capacity to not only engage in dialogues, but to be able to get hundreds of thousands of people involved in this and being able to use technology to then transform that into solid and real qualitative and quantitative data, which then became that capacity to tell that story in a much more truthful way and bring it into the food systems directly from the rural populations themselves. And you can't say that that is not absolutely fundamental in terms of then looking at that and then informing the decisions at the political level or at the policy levels, or in terms of the programs and projects that we then create. But we have to take the time to do that. We have to integrate that as a natural element in the structures, because we have the data, and I know that Katie, you're going to tell us about that. We have the technology to do this. And that's where innovation comes in. Now, how do we actually tell that story? And that's the other thing about storytelling. How do we tell that story so that it is now integrated as a fundamental part of moving forward in a more dignified manner? Meaning that the decisions that we have the capacity to take at the political level actually also reflect what populations are truly saying that they need, and that they feel heard and understood, that it's not just speaking just to make the feel-good aspect, right? And it's not just empty advocacy, but it is linked to real concrete possibilities for action and change. Education is action is change, right? Information is action change, and storytelling, if it's done well, is action is change. But Katie, I know that you've been working a lot on this as well, and you know, tell us a little bit from your perspective how you've been able to start impulsing this through the work that you've been doing.
Sure. No, it's the thing that comes to mind if we're leveraging this idea, right, that we can change futures based on the types of innovations that we choose to pursue, and that when those innovations are connected to as best as possible the realities of human experiences and the most ethical approaches to connecting with them, that will make the world a better place, right? So a couple of examples from the corporate innovation space, which is where I come from, obviously. So I know we're approaching this from two different angles, but we have something to learn from one another, and we know that. One example is the Nike Fly Ease shoe that just came out in the last few years. There was a lot of internal debate about whether to pursue that initiative. And it started with a letter that a young boy wrote to the CEO of Nike. And he said, I need a shoe. He had cerebral palsy. His name was Matthew Walser. He said, I need a shoe I can put on without having to use my hands. I need to be able to slip it on, but I still want to be able to play basketball with my friends. And how can you make that happen for me? And the CEO was very moved by the letter. He did a Nike Fly Ease challenge inside the organization, and employees came up with innovation ideas and as a response to that innovation challenge. But then those concepts were met with a lot of internal feedback. You know, is there a big enough marketplace for this if we go commercialize it? There was an ethical drive, there was a desire, and there was innovation, and yet the barrier to getting Matthew the shoe that he needed was this challenge of how do we change the world's perception and commercialize that. And so they ended up using storytelling as a mechanism to essentially help the public move towards a view that we should all be interested in technologies and innovations, even if we're talking about a gym shoe, that helps support a more inclusive world. And now Matthew has his shoe and anyone can buy the Fly Ease. And there's another example I'll share really briefly. It's a 2-minute video and I think it's worth us watching. And it's from Microsoft.
My name is Grover.
Sean. My name is Ian.
I'm Taylor. My name is Owen, and I am 9.5 years old.
I only have 1.
And yeah.
I love video games, my friends, my family, and again, video games.
Whenever I play it, it makes me feel happy. The fun that you get to have with connecting with your friends.
You make your own rules?
It's his way of interacting with his friends when he can't physically otherwise do it.
When I'm playing with a regular controller, there's some things that don't work for me.
It's difficult for me to use both joysticks and the D-pad at the exact same time.
And it just slowed me down a bunch more while other people were like...
She's never had the freedom to play at the level she knows she could.
I never thought it was unfair. I just thought, hey, this is the way it is and it's not going to change.
What I like about the adaptive controller is that now everyone can play.
I don't even have to look at the controller and just be like looking at the screen like, hey, yeah.
You never want your kid to feel like an outsider or an other.
One of the biggest fears early on is, how will Owen be viewed by the other kids?
He's not different when he plays.
It's a little challenging, but that's the whole point of gaming.
I can hit the buttons just as fast as they can.
And I think I can crush my friends.
No matter how your body is or how fast you are, you can play. Oh, yeah! It's a really good thing to have in this world.
One of the takeaways from this that Helen and I want to point to is over the last several years, our team at Untold Content has been doing some of the world's leading research on storytelling and its impact on innovation. So where does it show up within the innovation process? How does it drive buy-in, or how does it enable for new methods of innovation to happen? And we spoke with over 100 global innovation leaders, did state of the field reports, which you can download on our website, by the way, if you're interested in digging into some of the data behind this. But ultimately, through qualitative analysis of that data, we were able to identify these are the 5 drivers of innovation storytelling. There's a reason why when you listen to Owen's story, it resonates with you, or perhaps it does. There's a reason why certain innovation stories get a green light and why 75% sit on a shelf. And these are the conditions essentially that must be met for an innovation story to be most impactful. So impact, right? It's the ability to blow minds where needed, where you need to inspire and bring to light all the potential and the big picture vision of what's made possible thanks to an innovation. But impact also refers to the need to temper expectations and not overpromise or lie or sort of cover up what the challenges might be to creating an innovation. Empathy refers to, I think this is most in line with what we've been talking about so far in terms of dignified storytelling, right? That ability of a story to deeply connect with an audience, to make that audience feel known and heard, and to ensure that they actually are known and heard through that process of innovating. And then the story that you're telling about the innovation, recalling those voices and bringing them to life. And then alignment, of course, any innovation is not going to move forward if it doesn't align with the mission of the organization. And more broadly, hopefully and ideally, it should align well with the kind of world we want to be living in. Evidence as well. So Hélène shared the story of being able to collect stories and transform them into data to help the UN make clearer decisions about future directions. And so any kind of high impact storytelling inside the innovation process has to use data effectively. And we can share a couple of examples too of data storytelling in just a moment. But finally, engagement, right? This is where creative packaging and surprising elements and using certain truths about narrative arcs and story patterns that we're all kind of used to hearing in life in Pixar movies or in really great TED Talks. And how do we leverage that kind of memorable, resonating, those kinds of strategies to help create engagement. And so when you get these things right, it leads audiences more, they're more able to enter what's called a state of narrative transport, meaning that feeling that you get when you're listening to a story and you're sort of suddenly no longer sitting in your seat where you are in the moment, you're in the story. You are more adaptive, you're in an open state of mind, you're feeling connected, you're seeing something that you didn't think was possible before. And there's some really interesting research in the innovation management space where certain types of storytelling techniques can help make narrative transport possible, and other kinds of techniques can shut it down depending on the type of innovation you're trying to communicate. So, for example, one really interesting technique to know is if you're talking about a highly disruptive innovation idea, a future state that's probably 50 years beyond what we live in now, and everyone's driving hovercrafts in the sky and the world looks very, very different. I'm just teasing, but when you're speaking of highly disruptive or sort of future or far-fetched ideas, it's actually a really bad idea to try to depict that using a metaphor. Research shows that metaphors confuse audiences when they're trying to disconnect from a current state. But metaphors are really powerful examples of storytelling techniques for talking about systems improvements or incremental innovations. And so certain techniques and strategies you can lean on for different types of innovation. And that's what our team has been working to unpack so we can essentially create toolkits and epic examples of this at work. Yeah, so I think, right, Hélène, that idea, and this loops back to data storytelling. Maybe I'll share one last example of that, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts. But this is an example, right? We tend to think about data as something very separate from story, but interestingly, really anytime you're choosing to present a certain statistic or choosing to emphasize certain data points over others, we have to as humans make sense of that. And here's an example from the National Geographic. This is an infographic that was created to depict, to help tell the story of malnourishment. And the ruler on the side is meant to be cut out and then used to show what malnourishment looks like in terms of mid-upper arm circumference. And these are the real stories of children in different geographic areas and their actual mid-upper arm circumference. So the person touching that magazine can actually get a tactical feel for what that feels like to be that malnourished, and to then ideally be driven to take action or at least be enlightened to the problem.
And I think this is it's a really interesting, I think, point to link back to the fact that there are so many stories to tell. But at the same time, we're at a point in the world where we have the capacity to reach out. And we're in a very busy world in terms of communication, information, what is real, what is not, right? Our capacity to tell stories from all walks of life, and that everybody is trying to have a voice, and everybody is trying to get noticed, and everybody is trying to get that engagement and that buy-in for support or for whatever outcome there is. So the importance to take a step back and say, what is going to actually rise above the noise? What is going to be making that difference? How am I going to use my power in terms of storytelling to be able to cut through the many others who are trying to get, to get attention? And I think what we see is that there is a necessity to go back as we try to do that to truth, credibility, facts-based narratives, because there is so much of a competition out there to try to drive stories, to get engagement, to get, to fundraise, and so on and so forth, that now there is a necessity to go back, and those who are making it and rising above are saying, look, we are telling you this, and this is how it connects to our life. This is how it connects to you. That engagement, and I think that we showed it on the screen a little earlier. How do you get that engagement that will drive to action? Is when we're capable of saying, this does relate to you. It does relate to me. For instance, for us, when we're talking about the importance of smallholder farms, a few years ago, you would have never seen farming on the front page of the New York Times. You would have never seen, a big debate at the heart of the top of the BBC World on the importance of smallholder farms. But why is this getting attention? It's because there's also been a connection made through storytelling. And again, I'm talking about fact-based storytelling between those farmers and our food. When we eat, what are we eating? Who's growing those food, right? And so if we go back to the core necessity, it goes back to our survival, our necessity to be able to understand how we're going to create survival for our families into the future. So we're looking at the state of the world today in terms of climate, in terms of the different shocks, in terms of COVID, and we're linking it back to going back to the roots of how we live and the sustenance and where it comes from. And that's where farming gets involved. And so if we craft that story well and we say, you know what, a third of the food is produced by these people, we have to pay attention. We have to understand the domino effect, and we have to know how to use the words to do that well. And we have the capacity now to then link it to the involvement of other sectors that we're never paying attention, because they have solutions. They have innovative solutions to enable us to further the necessity for resilience of those farmers out there, for instance, right? We are able to connect the dots with corporate action to say, you corporate, in the corporate world, you have an opportunity, you have the knowledge and technical solutions that you can also bring to the floor so that we advance on sustainable practices together. But it's the way that we tell the story to create that engagement. So I think there's a lot to learn here in terms of not seeing this as a side issue, but seeing it as a core issue, because we can't act in silos anymore. And so we need to have that capacity and understand how we're going to use the storytelling linked back to the data and the reality and the dignification of the populations that we are working with into the mix to be able to lead to those solutions. So it's a big circle. And I know sometimes it sounds like, wait, you're trying to connect too many things here, but actually it's the way that we connect the dots from the most vulnerable communities to populations, to politics, to corporate solutions, to working together as a humanity to use our strengths to be able to move forward. And that can be done through proper information sharing, through proper storytelling, through having the tools to be able to connect those dots and the technical platforms that we now have available, so that we have access to those stories that we didn't have access to, so that we debunk rumors and misinformation to be able to lead to sustainable solutions. And I think, Katie, you've seen this, I think, in the work that you've done recently. I think that's why you're getting also a large buy-in into the importance of storytelling as we shape our worlds.
Yeah, I think, the idea that innovators can sort of live in isolated silos of small teams and only remain within their organization or corporate bubble, that is no longer the accepted best practice for innovation management. We see cross-disciplinary thinking and again, that desire to make the world a better place as we move towards the futures that we want to see in the world. That's a pretty heavy weight on the shoulders of innovators. And so learning how to effectively storytell, especially among those innovation team members who are the agriculture specialists, the experts, the technicians, the engineers, the coders, those who work with highly complex scientific and technical information. Storytelling can feel very uncomfortable, right? Most people with that background were not necessarily trained to think about how to hear the way that they're communicating information. And unfortunately, that's one reason why we're in such a crisis of a distrust of expertise in general in the scientific community. And the world is in some ways at war with expertise. And partly, I believe that storytelling has a major role to play in helping experts win the trust of the general public by communicating what they do and what they know, in a way that is able to actually be digested by the general public. And that takes first breaking out of the bubble or the ivory tower, and engaging with community, engaging with users, and in a cross-disciplinary way. That's the most effective way to sort of make that happen at a physical level. But ideologically, if we're not training our engineers to be able to communicate effectively, and if we're not helping innovation leaders think about the power of their strategic narratives and the power of pulling other stories upwards into those narratives, then we're missing something hugely important to how we're going to, again, move towards the futures that we all want to see. And there's John with his friendly face to remind us that it's time to start addressing these incredible questions in the Q&A.
You have 2 minutes left if you'd like to finish off.
Thanks. I think it's really interesting. And this is really a way to start thinking, to put these issues on the table, to get different people to start thinking of how they're moving forward with their expertise, to be able to go from their expertise to being able to share it. I know a lot of technical experts feel as though they have all this knowledge, but it doesn't relate to others, or they don't really see the story behind it, right? We saw that, for instance, when we tried launching, we launched a global campaign on oceans, right? And protecting our oceans and linking that to plastics. And the tremendous campaign and the impact that it had and the buy-in of corporations and so on had to do with the basics of storytelling that was based on data and technology. And a lot of technical experts and climate experts and so on had a lot of data, but they hadn't been able to bring it into the public in a way that people felt compelled to act, to change their behaviors, because really that's what we're talking about. We're also talking about changing behaviors, changing social behaviors, changing our way of believing that we impact the world we live in, and that we have the capacity to impact the world that we live in. And to be able to see that in a much more realistic way through the data that shows you that actually your actions do matter, right? We saw that during COVID, when everyone went into confinement. The world, for a while, when almost the entire world was confined, the world was reborn at an ecological level, right? And so that shows the impact that we have. And so we have to have the capacity to be able to tell that story in other ways, so that people also are part of the change that we need them to be part of. When we're talking about meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, when we talk about meeting the 2030 agenda, this is not just discussions at a political level. These are not just decisions that are going to be made through new policies and through engagement at that level, but it requires that innovation that comes from across the world. It requires being in touch with the local realities and local needs, but also leveraging local knowledge. And we have the capacity through that new and innovative technology to use local knowledge into decision-making for action. I think that's something that we really need to understand is at the heart of this thinking and discussion on storytelling and dignified storytelling.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, and I'm almost apologetic for interrupting. It's been such a fascinating discussion. We now move on to the question and answer section, and I can tell you that the Q&A box is on fire with lots of questions. So we have about 10 minutes, we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. And there are two questions which I thought would cluster well together, and they're very relevant, of course, for IFAD. So the first one, and maybe if we start with you, Helen, then we move on to you, Katie, is how do we tell stories of poverty, malnutrition, and war in an innovative way? And then a similar question is, how can cultural differences or ecosystem realities impact on the acceptance of the story across different parts of the world? So if I can hand those over to you. Thank you.
Okay, those are big questions.
Yeah.
But how do we tell them in an innovative way? You know, I think that we have to, again, think innovatively in terms of how those stories are going to relate to the audiences that we're telling them to be able to use that innovation. Because what is clear is that people are tired of hearing of, you know, suffering and of bad news and of the disaster of the world. However, if in an innovative way we can talk about those stories and showcase some of the solutions, the participation that they can have, the actions that they can engage in to actually impact the stories that we're talking about, then it becomes a whole different story. And so through the technological platforms, through social media, through the interactivity that we now have at our fingertips, we have that capacity to not only tell the story, but create that engagement and that direct response and that participation, that discussion where they feel part of the story, where it's not just, you know, watching bad news, but feeling as though here are some of the solutions that I can do to specifically impact. Whether it's going to be the donate button that is more the traditional, you know, you're watching a story and donate here, and that has been a long, you know, technique in terms of fundraising, but even more that, what can you do? You know, think about poverty and how it's affecting your own community. And what are some of the changes that you can do in your own community and the lessons that you take and that you share with others? There are many, depending on the audience, right? There are many ways to engage different audiences if we're trying to get youth engagement on acting for the future, on alleviating poverty and hunger. If we are trying to speak to, obviously, donors or politicians, there are different ways. Still, I think the root of that is making sure that once we understand who that audience is, how are we going to get them to feel they are part of the solution? And I think that's key in innovative storytelling and innovations in the way that we still tell stories. And there's also, you know, the way that we present, the branding, the interactivity, again, through technology that allows us to create that pull. And the credibility, and of course, just very quickly, linking that to the data and information that we didn't necessarily have once upon a time, and that now we can include in a much more relevant and innovative way. Katie?
I think you did a wonderful job answering that.
Okay, fantastic. So let me move on to the most upvoted for question. How do we make sure that storytelling doesn't become a marketing exercise?
Yeah,
I'll hand that over to you, Katie.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really grateful for the honesty of this question, right? A lot of the examples that I shared could be construed that way, or simply are, right? Perhaps Microsoft's brand credibility goes up when they are now perceived as an inclusive company that's driving forward that an awareness of difference, and they're willing to put innovative dollars behind it, right? I think from the perspective of many people on this call, you're here, you're working on innovation on a global stage, and I think I would challenge this question a little bit. There's a hollowness to the idea that if we blow something off as marketing and we say, well, that's marketing, that it loses its ethical purpose and drive. I think I would challenge that a bit and say what I think Helen and I are hoping to forward today is an idea that the ability to storytell effectively can, it uses the art and science of content marketing and visual presentation and communication strategies, right? We can, right, since the time of Aristotle, us humans, we've been, and before, I should say, far before, we've been working to understand what motivates and persuades and makes humans aware of issues. In my opinion, we ought to be leaning into strategies that help forward ethical, truthful information, and the practices and principles around marketing can be effective for helping us do that. Because, right, to Helen's point about misinformation and disinformation, they are using marketing tactics to propagate a lot of incorrect information, and they're winning. So, right, we have to be able to use those, I don't mean the same strategies, I just mean that the ability to distill complex information in a more simplified way to help communicate a direction and do that in an ethical manner. That's what we're tasked with as innovators. And so that I think those are some of my thoughts around that question. But Helen, I'd love to hear if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think it's really important to take a step back when we think, okay, it is linked to marketing, but actually we have to also understand that our world is everything we do. And I said that at the beginning, everything we do is based on storytelling and the way we share information. Politics and policies are based on sharing information. The decisions that we make every single day in our life has to do with the information that we receive and what we make out of it and how we understand it. And whether we understand it in the right context or not, that will lead to different outcomes, right? The way that we understand it. There's a really interesting exercise when, we're talking to each other, let's say, and if we had the time to do this, it'd be interesting. We talk to each other and I'm going to tell you a story and I'm going to have you write it back to what you've heard. And many times it might not, the way that you write it back might not be what I meant to say or what I intended to say at all. And the point is not just the word, it's the context, it's everything that is around the word that I'm using that will impact what I am trying to tell you, right? So it's the way that we share information to lead the world forward is absolutely key. The way that we decide on the programs that are going to be most effective for the populations that we serve on a daily basis has to do with the information that we're getting. I will always remember the fact that, when Kofi Annan, a former Secretary General of the UN, walked into his office one day and he saw a photo, because let's not forget that visual is storytelling, right? He saw a photo of a child that touched him in a very particular way. And he said, "Where is that?" And we said, "Haiti." He said, "We're going to Haiti." Haiti became a top of the agenda on that picture, really, literally. And the entire work and obviously there was a lot of work being done in Haiti, but the fact that he was emotionally connected to what that picture was saying as a story. And there is a whole story behind that, right? The fact that it was purposefully put on top of the desk, but it did create that emotional buy-in to say, let's go and let's do this. And this whole strategy, I want to see the strategy on Haiti and what we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. So the visual, I think that's another thing that we can, add to the mix, is that we are in a world where our minds are shifting. We have a lot less patience to digest a lot of information. People no longer read, 100-page reports and so on and so forth. Ourselves in our circles, our member states are consistently reminding us of that. People are used to very quick, interactive, and yet we have to make sure that because people are very quick in making decisions, have no patience, are very visual, need a lot of information, but they make life-changing decisions based on that. We have to know how to adapt to get through that so that they are not making the wrong decisions based on wrong information because we only have 100 characters to tweet. I mean, the world has become to a point where it's dangerous because we have very little space to make a difference. We have very little space to communicate facts. We have very little space to make sure that we are not falling into disinformation. And that is why it's so easy for disinformation to spread. And so how are we going to do that? We have to use the tools, but we have to understand how people think and react. And so the visual aspect of it is another, we have to be putting that predominantly in the way that we communicate forward. and into the future. And understand that that is a strategic thinking, that the visual, the words, the way that we do that is linked to strategic thinking and the capacity to connect the dots, the political, economic, social environments linked to the dignification of those we are telling the stories for or them, and making sure that they themselves are there telling their own story and no more interpretation, right? Because now the technology enables us to do that. And so I think that's really what we need to try to integrate into everything that we do every day. When we're talking about pause before you share, make sure you know the sources of the information that you're sharing. Make sure you understand what you're looking at and what it refers to so that you're not being manipulated. That a lot of that has to do with the basics of storytelling. So learning how to do that and learning how, your own capacity to learn how to better tell the story you're trying to tell will help you also understand how to interpret the stories that are coming to you to make more effective decisions that are going to lead to more sustainable outcomes and a stronger and better future, no?
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, both of you, for that. And so, unfortunately, that ends the Q&A section, and I'm afraid we didn't get time to answer everybody's questions. But thank you very much for putting them in. So for the final 4 minutes or so, the final section of this event, I want to hand the floor back to our guest speakers one final time, so that they can offer some final thoughts, and also if they would like to suggest some practical tips or actions for our listeners here today. So Katie, if I hand the floor over to you first, you have a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. And that's painful to walk away from the Q&A. Thank you everyone for those questions. I'm happy to continue the conversation offline. I think overall concluding thoughts are that stories matter, especially to the art of innovation, and that we can use creative and interdisciplinary thinking to accelerate innovation cycle times and decrease the time that it takes to garner buy-in and to make decisions, and hopefully the decisions around the futures that we want to see. Here are 3 practical things I think innovation managers and leaders should be working on. Number 1, story crafting, practicing different ways of communicating your strategic initiatives, being very iterative and adaptive to feedback. Number 2, setting up systems and processes whereby you're able to collect stories from communities you're working to serve or individuals within your teams, and making sure that there are systems in place for gathering those stories and leveraging them upwards. There are some new technologies. I know our team at Untold is starting to craft new technologies around story collection and story sharing in this way, leveraging OpenAI. And so anyway, if you're interested in talking more about that, I'm happy to take that offline. And the third is most of our research pointed to the fact, like I mentioned, that most innovators don't have training in this art and science. And so train teams in innovation storytelling and in data storytelling, give them the strategies, the toolkits, and the examples that they need to see what's possible and what others have done. I loved some of the questions coming in the Q&A, like, if we're in a community without resources to fancy marketing videos and photographers, how do we still tell stories? And there are practices from immersive theater that you can use with very little budget that help bring multiple voices to life and create collages of stories that can then be displayed as part of a strategic innovation narrative. And so there are a lot of examples like that. I know our team at Untold has innovation storytelling trainings that we do, data storytelling trainings, and we're seeing really interesting impacts at groups at NASA, at Boeing, at DuPont, and we're just presenting these to different teams around the world. And I think ultimately what I hope you walk away from today is an empowered view that this is a strategic art and science that you can study, that you can lean into, that there's information out there for you to access, that it does have a scientific connection to the way worlds are made, the way that we transform and shape our futures. And I'd love to talk with you more about that after this experience.
Thanks, Katie. And I think that's a perfect way to transition very quickly to maybe just a practical tip. When we talked a little bit earlier about dignified storytelling and the importance of incorporating that in the way that we communicate. And so just remember that dignified storytelling recognizes that biases, stereotypes, social stigmas, and power differences exist. and avoids perpetuating them through thoughtful and inclusive planning and communication. It's really important to understand, because it is easy to have the misperception or to take data. We have a lot of work that we are seeing here, but without really contextualizing it because we're not necessarily on the ground. So stop and understand that how you are translating the information you're getting to lead to action, how that involves or creates secure or could endanger the communities that we are talking about. I think that's really important. And then another practical tip, and so I would recommend you looking and reading into dignified storytelling. It's a long discussion in and of itself. But another tip is, many times I get the question of how, you say there's a story in what I'm doing or in the work that I'm doing, or in the information that I have, but how do I translate that efficiently? Because people don't understand. I'm a agriculturalist. I have very specific knowledge, but people don't relate. But think about, what is it important? What is of the work that you're doing that is important? And imagine explaining it to a 5-year-old. And that's the basics of getting into that engagement in storytelling. And it may sound very simple, but actually a lot of people forget to do that. A lot of people forget to simplify, go back to the core purpose of what they are trying to express and why it's important to get that buy-in or engagement into innovation, and to getting in their knowledge into the global perspective, into that global story. So I think, we could go on and on, Katie and I, to talk about this, but really what we want you to take out of this is, again, and I'm going to re-specify what Katie said, it's a strategic necessity to understand that storytelling is the key of moving the world forward. And the way that we tell the stories is going to be the opportunity that we have to actually create impact and change, to make sure that our programs, our operations, our policies, our politics moving forward are more inclusive, are therefore more sustainable, and create the capacity to a more peaceful and secure world moving forward. And so I really hope you think about this, and I'm always available for questions as we continue. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for bringing this topic to the table. It's not an easy one always to breach, but I think this has been great, Katie, to be able to talk about this together. Thank you so much for that work. We're very grateful.
Absolutely, and the same from all of us here at IFAD as well in the innovation talks. So unfortunately, I have to say that brings us to the end of today's event. But I very much hope that everyone listening found it as interesting and useful as I did. And remember, as was just said, that the principles that have come up today are readily transferable. So don't be afraid to try them out when writing reports, concept notes, speeches, or anything in your daily work. So finally, don't forget to sign up to the IFAD Innovation Network if you haven't already done so, and the link should be in the chat right now. And if you can't wait for your fix of innovation action at IFAD, the Change, Delivery and Innovation Unit will be hosting a one-day event on Tuesday, the 21st of June, called Innovation Day as part of the IFAD 22 conference, where we will be joined by the governments of Finland, Italy, Israel, and the United States, as well as the World Bank, the European Space Agency, the Regenerative Society Foundation, and VentureWell, with a media partnership and patronage of RAI Italian Television. So a fantastic lineup for Innovation Day, and I'm sure you will agree. And again, I think there's a link to that event in the chat box now, so don't miss it. But once again, from all of us here, thank you very much to Hélène and Katie for a fascinating discussion, and that's all for today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.